Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest Knoca event. I think most of you on this call probably know what Knoca is, but just in case, Knoca is funded by the European Climate Foundation and aims to improve the commissioning, the design, the implementation, the impact and evaluation of climate assemblies. And it's on the final one of those issues, the evaluation of climate assemblies, that today's workshop is focused on. Before we get going, just a couple of housekeeping tips. We are recording this part of the first part of the workshop, and we'll also be recording the end. A number of people aren't able to make it, and also we will be hopefully continuing the conversation that comes out of this event on our LinkedIn pages, which we will send you links for. Just as before we start, a bit of climate assembly news. We always like to keep you up to date. There are at the moment 3 national climate assemblies that are running in Austria, in Luxembourg and Spain. And just out of interest, we've just discovered that, or just heard that the Estonia, the first Estonian assembly, which was a regional assembly, which was interesting because it was engaged only young people, as recently reported, and we shall put a news item up for that very soon. So anyway, let me just talk to you a bit about the structure of this workshop. It is focused purely on the question of evaluation. We've had a lot of discussions and interest from people around that issue, and we thought we ought to start putting out some guidelines around evaluation. And we thought, well, what better way than doing that than sort of building on the collective intelligence of the Knoca community. As many of you all know, the OECD has published its guidelines for how to evaluate deliberative processes like climate assemblies. But what we're interested in today is to thinking about how we might supplement those guidelines, thinking about climate specific evaluation. So what is it that we need to be evaluating, not because this is a citizens assembly, but because it's a climate assembly? And so what we thought we'd do today was to start with a couple of presentations, one from Jane Carrick, who'll be talking about some of the trends in evaluation of climate assemblies, looking at what the OECD has suggested should take place, and then what assembly evaluations have covered to date. And then we'll have a short panel conversation where I'm going to talk to 4 people who are involved in evaluations of climate assemblies. And that's Stephen Elstob from the University of Newcastle, who led the evaluation of the Climate Assembly UK. Christina Dembski, who was part of the CAST team, who also looked at Climate Assembly UK and did some comparative work with other assemblies, including France. Nadine Andrews, who is from the Scottish Government, who has led the evaluation of the Scottish Climate Assembly. And lastly, Mathieu Soyo, who is the Senior Research Fellow at Integri in France. And they did a really interesting piece of research, which he'll talk about later. So hopefully they'll give us a bit of input, and then we'll be breaking into groups to actually brainstorm ideas around the kinds of things we should be evaluating and how we might do that evaluation. The idea then is we start collating that. I'll talk about what we're going to do with it afterwards, but the idea is that helps us in the sort of first draft of thinking about providing guidance on evaluation. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to my colleague Jane Carrick, who works with me as a research fellow at the University of Westminster on the project. And Jane has been reviewing the different evaluations that have been produced and looking at them in relation to the OECD guidelines. So for those of you who have not seen the OECD guidelines, there's a link, I think, in the chat. Jane will quickly introduce that, but she'll also be specifically thinking about the climate aspect. So without further ado, Jane, would you like to take the floor?
Thank you, Graham. Thank you for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. Bear with me 2 seconds. Is that the right screen?
No.
We're seeing it with your notes, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I know. I'm just sort of trying to, right, okay. Is that the right one?
You're showing the same one as before.
Is that the right one?
I think you might have to use that, because if you go on the other one, it just shows us your view screen. So you might just have to work with that, I'm afraid.
Okay. Okay, so sorry guys, I can't see what you're seeing, so it's a bit complicated. Yeah, my name's Jane Carrick. I'm a research fellow working with Graham at the University of Westminster. I'm here today to talk about the evaluations that have been done on climate assemblies to date in comparison to the recently published OECD guidelines, evaluation guidelines. Hopefully you can see my second slide there. Basically, the OECD guidelines, for those of you who have not seen them, I'll just give you a quick overview of what they contain. They've presented a framework for evaluation of deliberative processes based on a 3-step cycle. And this roughly translates as things to evaluate about a process before the process starts, which they call process design integrity. So it's like the design of the process and how it was set up. And then the deliberative experience, that was evaluating how the deliberative process unfolded. So that's kind of during the process, and then the elements that happen after an assembly, a deliberative process, which they call pathways to impact, which sort of encompass things to do with how influential the outputs of a process are. And hopefully you can see that that table there. These are the separate elements in each of those 3 steps. I'm not going to go into each of these specific elements because they are detailed obviously in the OECD guidelines that you have a link for in the chat. But what I am going to talk about is what elements the evaluations of climate assemblies specifically have covered that the OECD hasn't covered in their framework, and that might be things that are because that they've been evaluating climate assemblies specifically. But first I'm going to talk about the things that I think, the elements that I think the OECD guidelines do cover that I can't see that have been well covered in the evaluations of climate assemblies to date. So what I would say, so I'll start with the process design integrity. So these are the elements of evaluation before process begins. So some of the evaluations considered the representativeness of the participants, and the evaluations of the UK and the Scottish climate assemblies considered the purpose, design and framing of the assemblies. However, none of them, from what I can see, evaluated what the OECD call process design involvement. And this is evaluation of what the organisers call for, respond to and recognise from stakeholders regarding the deliberative process design. They don't really evaluate the range of stakeholders that had an opportunity to review the process, the experts that were consulted, or the consultation of deliberative democracy experts on process design. So that's not to say none of the assemblies did that. It was just that those bits weren't really covered in the evaluation of the assemblies. And then also there's I can't see from the evaluations that have happened to date much evaluation of the transparency and governance specifically. So according to the OECD, evaluation of transparency and governance should consider the clarity of and adherence to terms of reference, rules of engagement, codes of conduct and ethical frameworks, publication on information about goals, design and governance, and potential for external interference in the design. Again, that's not to say it wasn't done. It was just that the evaluation specifically didn't kind of focus in on those elements. With regard to deliberative experience, so these are the elements that occur during the actual assembly itself. most of the evaluations considered elements of the deliberative experience, especially what evidence was provided, the facilitation, opportunities to speak and respect between participants. But I couldn't see any of the evaluations that covered the use of accessible, neutral and transparent online tools specifically. Now that's possibly because the kind of conducting assemblies online is quite a recent occurrence, and for some of them, like the UK one, it happened during the actual assembly itself. But OECD, interestingly, have included that element within their within their evaluation guidelines. And there's also they want the OECD want evaluation of respect for members' privacy. So this is demonstration that privacy was protected and that there was no undesired attention or attempt to interfere from the media, stakeholders or other actors. And finally, if I just turn to pathways to impact, so these are the elements after a process is completed. Most of the evaluations considered how influential the recommendations have been to some extent. However, the following elements have not been covered so much. Specifically, the response to the recommendations and follow-up, including a monitoring plan. Caveat to that is one of the assessments of the French CCC did evaluate how the proposals, the extent to which the proposals had been implemented. And the other thing was member aftercare. I couldn't see anything in the existing evaluations that covered member aftercare. So that includes whether there was any provision for information how to follow, how members could follow the uptake of the recommendations, support for members to speak about their experiences, and channels of communication for the members to maintain connections between themselves. So if I just now turn on to what elements were unique to climate assemblies, so what elements were in the evaluation of climate assemblies that weren't actually mentioned, weren't actually part of the OECD guidelines. So specifically, unsurprisingly perhaps, there's pre-existing attitudes to climate change and pre-existing attitudes to climate change policies. So these are things, sorry, I should have said, these are sort of elements that would come under that process design integrity, i.e. the before bit. And then pre-existing political views, and also the framing of climate change science and policy solutions. And I thought that was a little bit different from the framing of the topic that the OECD talked about in their guidelines. And then in terms of deliberative experience, the French and the UK Climate Assembly both tracked, the evaluations both tracked changes in attitude to climate change, and the French one changing in attitudes to climate change policies. And then pathways to impact, there was one of the French evaluations did look at contribution of the proposals to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that was obviously something that's very specific to climate assemblies. So sorry, that's a bit of a really rushed look through at the evaluation that I've been doing today. That's the some of the references that I've used there. And then if I hand back to Graham, is that okay?
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jane. So that gives us an idea of some of the things that have or haven't been covered in evaluations in relation to the OECD guidelines. What I'd like to do is to bring 4 people in just for a brief conversation around what to build on some of the things that Jane has just been talking about. And that's Stephen, Christina, Nadine, and Mathieu. So I'm I'm just waiting as Mia, our controller, is able to bring everybody in. Nice to see everybody. So I'm going to take this in some sort of order. I'm not quite sure what the order is, but I'm going to start with Stephen, who was the lead evaluator for Cork. So I'm just kind of interested, Stephen, you were actually the first person, I guess, to actually be charged with doing an official evaluation of a climate assembly. And I know you've also done the Scottish one since, but I'm kind of interested as to whether or not when you were asked to do the Climate Assembly, Climate Assembly UK, whether you did include any climate specific criteria during your evaluation.
Yeah, and I guess it was going to show the sort of journey that researching and evaluation on climate assemblies has gone on, because not really. And the reason for that was, like I say, it was the first. It was, so nothing to guide me previously. I hadn't been a climate change researcher, was my background. I was collaborating with David Farrell along with Jane, who you just heard from on the evaluation. And, our background is both in deliberative democracy, and that's why Parliament commissioned us to provide the evaluation. And actually, they were very specific that they wanted us to look at it as a citizen assembly and how it conformed to norms and practice of citizens' assemblies. And then CAST, and Christina will say a bit about this, I'm sure, then asked to look more at the climate change angle. So in the initial plan, there was nothing specifically there, but there was obviously crossover because it was a citizen assembly on climate. It was impossible not to end up doing some stuff on climate, obviously. So key things that sort of came out were, we looked at, as is standard in a citizen assembly, we looked at attitudes of the assembly members and how they changed through the process. But interestingly, we found that they changed quite a lot between recruitment and the start of the assembly. And we put that down to people knowing that it was going to be on climate change, looking a bit into it, going, oh my God, why aren't we doing something about it? And becoming more concerned about it than they were initially. And one reason why I'm saying that as a specific climate assembly thing, because I think with other issues, you might not get that same reaction before the actual process has actually started. We looked at public views of the assembly and how that related to public attitudes towards climate change. And again, I think that could be different to other issues. In particular, I think we found that the scope of the assembly was really, really important. It affected lots of things that happen within the assembly. So our study did look at within the assembly and external factors, mixed method study, and the scope of it, members learning, the provision of information, how the members were able to endorse the recommendations, the impact those recommendations then had on Parliament and government. These were all affected by things such as the division into streams, which is becoming very common with climate assemblies, but was unprecedented previously with citizen assemblies. So it does look like a specific climate assembly feature. And then finally, the shelf life of the recommendations. People, when we interviewed people, they said, I don't know how long this is going to be relevant because the debate just keeps moving on. And again, other issues could have that, but it's something I think is quite specific to climate change, how quickly, we've just seen the new IPCC report come out, and that's kind of, moved the agenda on and the urgency of the situation on again. So that's what we did, yeah.
Okay. Thanks. In terms of what you would like to have done, I guess you don't want to. You don't necessarily want to steal the Dean's thunder, because you.
I don't want to steal the Dean's thunder, because there was lots of things that I learned for doing Climate Assembly UK, which was collaborating with Dean, we were able to do, and I'll let her specify those things. But things that we haven't done in the Scottish one as well that I would like to do is firstly analyse the actual recommendations to see whether they would achieve the remits that they've been given. That's beyond, I'd have to collaborate with someone who was able to provide that sort of analysis, but I think that would be really useful.
Stephen, also, you're stealing Mathieu's thunder. That's what he did, but we'll come back to that.
That is what you did, Mathieu. Well, brilliant. Okay, fantastic. We'll look forward to hearing more about that. And then the media treatment of it, because I'm just starting to get into the literature on how the media report climate change differently to other issues, and it would be really, what we looked at, but in both Cork and the Scottish Assembly, we looked at media coverage. We looked at that during the Assembly. I'd really like to do a longer analysis and look beforehand how things changed. That's probably moving into research beyond evaluation, but I still think it's interesting.
No, I mean, I don't see why that's necessarily beyond evaluation. Actually, I think that's really relevant. So, thank you, Stephen. You sort of set up Christina nicely there, which was saying, well, CAST, which is a research centre that is very much focused on climate, also looked at Cork. So, Christina, what as coming to it from a climate research institute, what sort of things do you think you brought to the analysis to evaluation that maybe hadn't been there before?
Yeah, okay. I made some notes, and I think they speak to that point. And I think the report that we wrote, or that my co-authors wrote, because I was on maternity leave, it covers some of these in a lot more depth. So I'll just say a couple of things. I think because we are essentially experts in climate engagement and communications, and that includes engaging people in a deliberative way, I guess a lot of the things that we thought about was how the inputs into a climate assembly can inform how people engage and the recommendations that come out of it. So one of the things that was really important to us that we wanted to look at was sort of the design and the process and the framing of the process, and framing of the process can impact on climate deliberations. And that's because climate change, as we all know, and climate change and how to address it is really complex issue, and perhaps one of the most complex issues that climate assembly citizen assemblies have dealt with, because the issue spans generations, countries, all sectors of society. They involve really complex trade-offs and really important value questions, and a lot of those sort of elements are not necessarily considered in depth when we're looking at the way that the process is delivered, or the types of deliberations that are being encouraged or are being had in these assembly processes. It's much more complicated to evaluate those. There is not necessarily metrics or criteria that are developed for these things. And because we're an academic institution, we kind of get away with not necessarily looking at it in that way. But we know from our research that things like the framings that are used, the language and the visuals that are used, or what values are being emphasized or not emphasized, how uncertainty is communicated, or how system thinking is supported, they all inform how people engage with the issue, and ultimately then inform the kinds of recommendations that might be reached. So that was one of the major things that we wanted to look at, and then we did look at. So that includes things like what type of voting or what type of overarching questions are being asked, and how asking slightly different questions might lead to different outcomes, but also more specific measures like the different policy options that people might be able to look at. So for example, in the UK Climate Assembly, really people kind of appraised policy options that were already provided by experts. And I'm not sure how much scrutiny there was on how those policy options materialized. Whereas in some other assemblies, people were more able to, particularly the French one, produce recommendations sort of independent of that. And I know there was, in the UK one, there was a way that people could also come up with recommendations, but it was much weaker compared to others. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that I'll just briefly mention is around impact. And I know we're just working through this now, but different pathways to impact that particular climate assemblies could have, and that maybe haven't been thought of in that much detail. And I think Stephen already mentioned some of the stuff around media, but I think one of the other things is that oftentimes, perhaps as a surprise to many, is the sort of positive experience that people have. So this is observers, but also obviously the Climate Assembly members, and whether that can lead to engagement beyond just this one-off event or this climate assembly that's happening at one moment in time, and perhaps lead to actions in their own personal lives. So for example, how are climate assembly members continuing to engage with the issue moving forward, particularly as Stephen said, as the debate moves on, as there's policies that are proposed or not, and so on. But also more broadly, how are publics beyond the Assembly engaged? I think I'll just leave it at that. Those are sort of my main.
Christine, that's really helpful. I mean, what I take from that, is the extent to which CAST was really interested in the framing, and also this kind of thinking more broadly about the question of impact. So that's really helpful. Thanks, Christina. I'm going to turn now to Nadine, who had the biggest budget of everybody. So she has a lot to live up to here. So Nadine, you were able to kind of like build on the experience that happened in the UK and also elsewhere. And I'm wondering, you know, I'll be honest, I've seen the draft research report. It's excellent. So you've done some really good job and really interesting job. I'm interested, what else do you think you brought to the table in terms of thinking about climate in relation to assemblies, in terms of evaluation?
Yeah, thanks. So, biggest budget all went on my salary. So because Stephen was part of the team and was actually in position before I joined, because I joined late, I inherited some stuff when I came into the post. So we were already in the member survey using some of the same questions, or even many of the same questions that were used in Climate Assembly UK, but also in Citizens Assembly. So some of the questions around climate attitudes are questions which are core questions to Scottish Government. So it allowed us to do comparisons with like the Scottish Household Survey, for example. And then we had these knowledge questions as well, which were contested by different people in the research advisory group. But the idea there was to use different methods as a way to get a handle on what do people actually know about this topic, and all the subtopics that they were then discussing. For the thing which I specifically introduced because of my background in climate psychology was around emotional experience. So what were, for people who are learning about climate change and learning more about climate change and coming face to face with the facts of the crisis, they're going to be encountering all kinds of powerful, strong emotions which are difficult to be with. So I was really interested in that, and so we introduced questions around that and followed that through the Assembly, and indeed all the way to the weekend 8, which happened almost a year after the end of the Assembly, when they came back together to discuss the Scottish Government response. And it's really interesting to see the differences between their emotional experience and the population as a whole compared to the population survey that we did. And then also perhaps a bit of a stronger emphasis around the systemic approach, qualitative data around this. So this was interviews to actually handling, climate change as a topic. And then something else which we picked up from Climate Assembly UK was looking at outcomes for members in terms of, climate actions and civic actions, but the climate actions would be the thing that would be different to other assemblies. So because I wasn't there in the beginning, Stephen, and we've not really had this conversation, I'm not actually sure which elements weren't in the UK Climate Assembly that you then did introduce in ours. So I'd be quite keen to hear that as well.
Go on, Stephen, you've got another few seconds, half a minute.
Well, I'd forgotten in my bit that we looked at in Climate Assembly UK what happened to the Assembly members after the Assembly, and I know CAST were involved in that as well, and whether that led to specific climate change attitudes and behaviour beyond the Assembly itself. But I think what we really took from that we hadn't done in Climate Assembly UK, and we've done in Scotland, well, we think we've done in the Scottish Climate Assembly, is like drill down into the issue, systems level, individual level changes required, a focus on adaptation and mitigation in terms of the evidence provided, but also how Assembly members discuss it, but also then how that results in the recommendations they get at the end and how they relate to those different parts of addressing climate change, which we didn't do at all in Climate Assembly UK. I just wasn't set up for it. But I learned through doing Climate Assembly UK that this was actually something that was really important.
Yeah. So we did do a lot of analysis actually around the framing of the evidence, and not very much of that has actually made it into this report, but you know, some of it might find its way into an academic paper.
That's great. We've just shared, I've just been saying, we've been sharing the links as I've been talking to each person. We've been sharing links to the relevant reports. The one that is in Scotland is actually the interim report, I think, or there is a longer report to be published, I think. Is that right, Nadine?
No. So it'll be the full report that's all 160 pages.
But
so that is coming out on the 31st of March.
Okay. And I've had a sneak preview and it's very impressive. So thanks, Nadine. I'm going to end up with Mathieu, and it's not because they did their research last, it's actually because they did some really interesting research in Integri. One thing just to say is that in France, there was not a single evaluator or two, who were employed. There were a range of researchers who had access to the assembly and are producing lots of really interesting things. And then there was a range of people who then did evaluations afterwards. And the reason I wanted to bring in Mathieu is because he was involved in what I think has been a really novel piece of evaluation on Climate Assembly. So Mathieu, do you want to tell us about what it was that Integri did?
Yes, thank you. Yes, maybe a few words about the context, because Integri, we are involved in the process. So I think it's linked also to the evaluation, the assessment we made. Our scientific director was in the governance committee, so thinking at the beginning with others to what we are going to do with the CCC. And my director was part of the expert group. During the process, there was an expert group helping the citizens also with the proposition and recommendation. Myself, I just participated to one session on mobility as an expert, so I was asked by the citizen. And I had another colleague looking specifically at the process and talking with all the researchers, etc. At the beginning, before the CCC, we made an article, a blog, to say what should we expect from the citizen. And I think it was the beginning of the assessment we did 1.5 years after that, because we were a bit afraid that people were asking citizens things that they wouldn't be able to deliver, too much, a world vision of what we should do, the question about they are going to be the expert that are going to say what we need to do, etc. So we were really trying to say, okay, what at least can we expect of that? So we said in this first blog, it will be a success, and it's our point of view, it will be a success if it enables us on at least one important aspect of the transition to take a step forward, offers a solution to an existing bottleneck, or provides direction to policymakers and the French public alike on some form of acceptable response. So it was the beginning. And so at the end, there was the debate. So with the recommendation and the law, there was a public debate. Is it a good work? Is it credible? The NGOs were pushing the proposition, saying, yeah, it's very good. We should listen to the citizen. So we needed to have a piece based on a very careful look at the proposal, trying to say, okay, it's serious, and we can say something why we think it's serious. So what we did, and I can sum up very quickly, it was to say, okay, as expert of the different debates at Integri, so my colleagues on agriculture, my colleagues on mobility, on energy, etc., and based on previous study, we have an idea of the current debates, whether the proposal of the NGOs the parliamentary debates on former laws, on previous laws, for example. So the idea was to say, okay, if you compare to what was existing before the CCC, is it a step forward? And we decided to try to have a kind of a typology of the recommendation, to say, okay, there are some measures that we think they propose a more proactive trade-off that the one that existed before. Other recommendation, we thought that it was a progress because there were more systemic that existed before. For example, food practices and agriculture, but they did a good work to put it together. And so on some issues, also a fresh view of a question. For example, let's ban advertisement, which was something a bit pushy from the citizen. And also, we also pointed the weaknesses. So it was a very subjective, it was a really expert-based, and I think we at this time, we didn't have the time to support really all the analysis with, for example, literature review or parliamentary debates, precise review. But we were able to say, yeah, 2 years ago, for example, this NGO proposed this. It was seen as very radical. It was not in the law. And then now the citizen proposes something that is very much alike. So that's the way we work on this. And just a few words about the impact, the quantitative impact. During the process at the end, so there were like spreadsheets of measures, and the expert group was asked to say something about the probability of the impact and the size of the impact. Of course, it was a very, very difficult job. So in our study, we don't say our final word about the quantitative impact of what they propose, because remember, the Prime Minister asked the citizen, how do we do 40% reduction by 2030? So it was very precise. But our conclusion, and again, it's very qualitative and subjective, was to say, we think that's what they propose is in line with the transformation we need to reach these goals. So yes, and a very short summary of what we did.
And it's a really fantastic report, Mathieu, and I'm really impressed what was done. And I think it's the first time anyone's tried to do a systematic assessment of actually the nature of the recommendations that came out. So that's really helpful. So thank you the four of you. What the idea of having this quick discussion was to give everyone in the audience a bit of food for thought as to what has been done and to the kinds of things that might be possible. And what we'd like to do now is to sort of is to basically find out the wisdom of the crowd. We're going to put you into, or we're going to let you choose one of three breakout groups to join. One will be focused on what should we be evaluating before an assembly starts, what's often referred to as processing design integrity, although it could actually be more than that. Secondly, what should we be reviewing during the assembly? What should we be evaluating during the assembly? And then what should we be evaluating after the assembly? And we've so got two questions for you to think about. One is, what climate specific elements should we be evaluating at those points before, during, and after? And secondly, what methods should we be using? So the first group will be facilitated by Jane, the second by Nardine and the during by Nardine and Stephen, and after by Stuart and Christina. I wasn't in one of the groups, so I have no idea how that went, and it really was, I hope, a bit of a brain dump. But I'm going to hear a little bit. We're just going to get a little bit of feedback from the people who are leading it. So Jane, do you want to come in and just give us a taste, just a short, just a mere hint of what went on in your group before your internet collapsed?
Yeah, well, what went on was I got chucked out by my internet. So that's what went on. No, before I got chucked out, what we would discuss was we first of all touched on sort of the things that had been looked at in the evaluations and whether we agreed that they should be included, which was the attitude to the pre-existing attitudes to climate change. And I think that everybody in the group thought that was really important for a benchmark to so that could benchmark changes during the assembly. And then we also talked a little bit about how a climate assembly is designed to fit into the political process. So the German one was specifically designed to feed into an election cycle, and we weren't quite sure. We didn't really nail down how that could be evaluated, but it was certainly something that can be thought of at the sort of design stage. And also we talked about assessing the goal of the assembly, the framing, how language is framed in the question, and oh yeah, so yeah, we just wanted to make sure that the attitude thing was used as part of the selection process as well, but I think it was in some of the evaluations. Okay. And I have to apologize, Graham, I failed to get onto the methods question.
Okay, well, well, in which case you'll have to invent them all, I'm afraid. Okay, Jane, you'll be back in a minute. So, Stephen, can you report a bit on what happened in your group?
Yeah, neither did we get onto the methods.
Oh, God, I ask you to do something and you guys don't do it.
Yeah, you've asked us to cover too much in the time available. It's bad design, not facilitation. So we discussed things around argumentation, how people actually discuss the climate issue, and whether climate specific aspects of that as opposed to more sort of just general deliberative things, but how the issue actually affects deliberation as well. We spoke about the input of information, who decides what information is going in, what information does go in, whether assembly members learn from it, also misinformation and fact checking, not just from the experts themselves, but from the assembly members. So we spoke about how actually there's a lot of just incorrect things said, but the facilitators don't have the subject knowledge to be able to address that. So we spoke a bit about how in German planning cells it used to be process experts that facilitated it, and now we've completely moved away from that in deliberative mini publics to facilitators having the facilitation skills but no subject knowledge, and do actually for a climate assembly we actually need a combination of both. Okay. We talked about the agenda, the scope of the remit, and how that affected the production of recommendations and the number of recommendations, and whether assembly members should be given a role in actually determining their priorities, which might make it a bit more authentic to them, but also reduce the number of recommendations and be a more efficient use of the time available in the assembly. Nadine, is there anything else obvious that I'm missing?
That's right. I mean, just wanted to get a flavour, so that's
a flavour then. But yeah, I'm afraid we didn't get to methods at all.
Okay, well that looks as though we know what our next call is going to be on then. Okay, that's fantastic. And Stuart, who from CAST, who wasn't on the original panel, but led one of the groups. Are you there, Stuart?
Yeah, I am. Christina might want to chip in as well. We did bring in methods because of our high expertly nuanced facilitation approach. And I was scared that we'd be in trouble if we didn't. We tried to pick it up as we moved along. So I think there were a few strands that came out. So this was about evaluating after. One is the kind of quantification, the numbers, to what extent do the recommendations stack up? Would they do the job? So Mattia said a bit about that. So modeling the carbon emissions reduction of recommendations, but sometimes that's really hard. So for example, some recommendations just you cannot translate numerically. There was talk about evaluating the impact on politics. So do such things change the political space, the willingness of policy makers to do things, their receptiveness to certain ideas, such as there was mentioned that of a politician who said, I could never have imagined we would be restricting domestic aviation routes. And so the kind of methods from that, as well as some other things to do with policy makers and politicians, was conducting qualitative interviews with them, as well as potentially anonymous surveys, although they can be, this was not the word used, but slippery. It's hard to pin down politicians on what they really think.
Yeah. Good luck on that one. Yeah.
There's media coverage. So do these processes change how the media report on climate change? So you could look at media coverage pre-post. Again, it's hard to sort of draw a line and say what was the effect of the assembly. And then I suppose the other one was the influence on the wider public. Do these things change the wider public discourse, receptiveness to policies and measures? And again, that could be looked at with kind of survey methods and techniques. We've done a bit of that within CAST. Oh, and actually, finally, the final one was assembly members themselves. So following them up, their continuing engagement. There were some other things in the Google Doc as well, but that's some of the gist.
That's brilliant, Stuart. Someone had to do what I asked, so thank you for that, Stuart. Okay, that's great. I mean, that's only just given us a flavour. I've put the links to the doc so that people can go and have a look and maybe add stuff if they want to afterwards. Can I bring Jane back in, Mia? So, hi there. So this is about what we're going to do with what you've done and what we're going to do next. So, Jane, do you want to just talk about what you're going to do over the next few weeks with all this material?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I'll do is collate the information from the Google Docs into one document and have a look at that. I think what I'll also do as well is ask anybody that has any ideas that weren't captured in the Google Docs, just to maybe forward those as well. Obviously, I had my technical hitch, so I did miss a couple of minutes of my my discussion. So yes, if there was anything that I missed from ours, but certainly we would welcome any additional thoughts that people have afterwards. Ultimately, from that, I'll be pulling together a briefing note for the Knoca website as well, and what we want to do with these briefings and the material that we bring together is created in such a way that can be added to as new data becomes available as well. So when new evaluations come out, we can add to that and really see where the trends are going in terms of evaluation as well. And then yeah, so yes, Graham, is that okay?
Well, that's it. And also I think you're going to be part of what you'll be producing is a longer version of what you presented at the start, isn't it? In terms of the briefing. Sure. That's great. So we'll be collating. We'll continually collate what people are using for evaluation, but Jane will kind of do a summary of as things stand at the moment. So that's great. On that note, I'd really like to thank everybody for participating. This has been a bit of a roller coaster event, but I think it's been really great as a way of kicking off Knoca's discussions around evaluations, and we will be keeping you in tune with keeping you up to date with developments from us. If you are doing really interesting stuff on evaluation, please let us know, and we will send that round to those interested members. So once again, thank you from Knoca. I'd like to thank Mia for being a great host as ever. And so until next time, look forward to seeing you all then. Take care, everybody.